All right, so now that we are finished submitting assignment 7, sometimes we don't get the kind of focus effects that we want from our photos. So if we look at this photo that I took back for assignment 2, a texture study, looking down at a tree and kind of getting the whole inside, you can see 3 layers of depth. You can see that the foreground is out of focus here in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see that this kind of bulb area of the bark here and here are in focus, and then below it, looking down, out of focus again. But what I really wanted to focus on was inside the tree, right? And the problem is I can't get that from this photo because Photoshop can take away focus, but it can't add focus. So how can I address that in the future if I can't get the lens to do exactly what I want? Well, it's better to get the shot entirely in focus, where everything is in sharp focus, and then be able to take away selectively. But when we do that with just the blur tool, so if I make a duplicate here and I just use the blur tool that we've played with in the past, it's very slow going even on 100% strength. And I zoom in on these things and then I just blur it. It can be tricky to know where it should be blurred and where it should stay in sharp focus, right? So I'm going to show you a technique which uses a blur filter but maps it to a gradient that we create that kind of approximates the depth. So let's look at this photo, for instance. This photo has 3 layers of depth. The foreground here, these leaves out of focus. Actually, no, the foreground is in focus. It's the top of this cactus and all the prickles. And then going down into the depth of the beginning of this cactus, it's out of focus, and behind it, it's out of focus. But if I shot all of this in focus, I could use the blur tool maybe to make selective parts out of focus. But here I have basically everything in focus. What if I only want this little ridge right here? I'll paint it for you. What if I only wanted this ridge right here to be in focus? And so in front of it, I wanted this to be out of focus, and I'll do a different color. Ooh. So I wanted the foreground to be out of focus here, and I wanted the background to be out of focus behind it. Now I could use my blur tool, but it would take forever, and it wouldn't look even, right? So how can I get it to appear more like a lens effect? Well, I use what's called lens blur under my blur options. But in order to do lens blur, you have to tell the computer first how you want it to see the depth. And the way you do that is under this new option, which is called channels. And you'll see it next to your layers in the default setup. But you can always go to Window and click next to channels as well. Now, channels is how the computer sees images. Layers is set up in Photoshop to help you understand how images work. But channels is how the computer sees images. So our computers, these computer monitors are RGB monitors, which means they are made up of red, green, and blue light. There are little lights. And when you combine, say, just the red and the green lights, you get red, you get greens, and you get yellows. That's how light works. And then if you add in blue, you get the full spectrum. So this isolates all of those different lights. If you do green and blue together, you get the cyans. Right? So we are going to tell the computer what to do by programming with a new channel. And we add a new channel just like you add a new layer by clicking on this little icon here. It looks like a Post-it note. So when I click new, it creates a new channel and it calls it an alpha channel, alpha 1. With this alpha channel, which is just default black, I am going to use black and white because that's how the computer, which is binary, sees color, right? It just sees it as the lights being on or off, or partially on. And so I have to use black and white to show the alpha channel. And remember, I wanted this range in here to be in focus, this range out of focus, this range out of focus. So what do? I'm going to paint on my alpha channel a gradation. So I'm going to use the gradient tool, which is right above the blur tool, under the paint bucket. And I want to use just the standard gradient from white to black. And what I can do is I can paint across that whole scene a gradient from white to black or from black to white, whatever I want. I can make it more subtle by clicking and dragging at further extremes of the actual picture plane, or make it as contrasted as possible by going very close to the edges, but still overlapping them. So maybe something in between, something kind of like that. All right, now I have an alpha channel. And this basically tells the computer that it's going to treat each of these different gradients differently depending on how I want it to. So I can use lens blur and tell the computer, in this range, right here, I want you to treat the grays that are in that range to be in sharp focus. And as they get further away from that gray, either going lighter or going darker, and you can see the alpha channel as a red overlay here. As it gets to the deep red here, it's going to get more and more out of focus. And as it gets to the pure white up here, it's going to get more and more out of focus. And basically, I can use all those different gray values from my alpha channel and tell it to focus on that part and to blur the other parts. So how does it work? Okay, so once I've made my alpha channel, I go ahead and click on the RGB and turn off the eyeball on the alpha channel so I don't have to see that red anymore. Then I go back to my layers and I make a duplicate of my original, because just like the Gaussian blur filter, it's going to affect these actual pixels. And I always want to do it on a duplicate layer. Then I go up to filter and I go to blur, and instead of Gaussian blur, which we've used before, I go to lens blur. Now you can already see it's doing something. You have to source your depth map. So you want it to get its source from alpha 1. And you want it to preview so you can see what it's going to do. And I like to have it preview faster, because this can take a long time to process. But now realize that your alpha channel is just a gradation from white to black. And right now the black is what's in focus and the white is what's most out of focus. I can invert that so that it's the white that's in focus and the black that's out of focus. But neither of those is what I wanted. What I wanted was this ridge right here to be in focus. And so to do that, I have to find the right focal distance. And I can do that by using this slider. And you'll see that as I slide, it will just move through the different grays. So right now it's this ridge that's in focus. And now it's this ridge that's in focus. And now that's the ridge I wanted, right? But the easiest way to do it is to simply click where you want it to focus. So I want it to focus on whatever grays are in this range. Maybe right there, or maybe right here. And it will jump automatically to that focal distance. Now, with all of these iris shape options, I like to put the radius up very high, just like Gaussian blur, so I can really see where it's going to blur. And then, once I like what it looks like, remember I'm doing this all on a duplicate layer, You can also play with some of these other settings. See if you like the effects you get. You say OK, and then it will apply that blurring filter using your alpha channel as a depth map to your layer. Big difference. And then because I did it on a copy, I can use opacity and kind of blend it in and let it be a little bit more subtle. So why am I showing this to you now? Because it's a great way to be able to kind of strengthen your exposures where you want a control of depth, especially 3 layers of depth. So let's go to assignment 7. And let's say this project, this photo right here, I really want only the tip of those glasses to be in focus. The background's already out of focus, but I really want to take the focus down on here. And instead of using the blur tool and making it look kind of clunky, I'm going to try this new approach. So I'm going to go to channels. I'm going to create a new channel. It's called an alpha channel. I'm going to paint a gradient that maps the depth of the scene, basically going from foreground to middle ground to background. Then I'm going to turn on the RGB layer, click on that, turn off the eyeball on alpha 1 so I don't have to see that red the whole time. Go to my layers, make a duplicate, go to filter, go to blur, go to lens blur, source the lens blur from my alpha channel, set where I want it to be in focus, right on the glasses, and realize that it can't make the glasses in focus, right, if they weren't in focus in my exposure. But the very tip of it was in focus. But what I can do is really blur around it. So this is no longer in focus. And the background is even more out of focus than it was. And it's a way to kind of further strengthen the storytelling effect of my depth of field choices here. Again, this can take a little while, but it's a really fun tool to play with. Now where it becomes more difficult to work with, so you'll see the difference between that and that. Right? It just very believably takes the focus away from here and even more from here. So it's more focused on the glasses. Then I always do it on duplicate so I can blend it in. Is it as good as getting the depth and aperture effects in your exposure? No, it's always going to look a little cheesy. But it's a good way to be able to control the message of your photo. All right, so think of that as a little extra perk. Now, often this is used on landscapes. This kind of forced aperture. And sometimes you'll even see photographers that modify their lenses in a way that's called tilt shifting. But this can be easily faked through this use of lens blur in Photoshop. And what tilt shift photography, here are some examples. What it does is it kind of makes the full-scale real world look like it's a miniature, just because it's applying these aperture effects. Because this is how we see things in macro, right? Close up. And so to kind of take a photograph that looks like it's close up of something that's so big, like this convention hall filled with people and cars, makes it look like a little model. And it's just very simple. Blur the foreground, blur the background. That's how it works. Now, I can tell that this one wasn't done, it was done in Photoshop instead of done with actual lenses, because you can see how the tops of the buildings lose focus. And in order to do it really well, you would actually have to cut out the buildings, because that doesn't have the same depth as this behind it, right? Because just an even gradation like we've been doing